Hello everybody and a very warm welcome to my strategy show. It's been a while since we had our last session. I don't even know when it was, in May, maybe at the beginning of May. Can't remember. Hope that you remember. It's been a while since I've been away. I've been traveling all the time. That's why I couldn't have any shows, but I hope that you're happy that we are back. Today we have a show. Next week there will be another show, so we will learn a lot. Today's edition is a special edition. I'm going to talk about the Grand Chess Tour because you know that I've been involved both in the Paris and in the Leuven Grand Chess Tour. In the Paris one, I was commentating on the Spanish broadcast from the Hamburg studio of Chess24, and the Belgium one, I was actually there on site with Jan Gustafsson commentating in English. So it's been an excellent experience, especially being there on site in Belgium among those players, the best players of the world. Also, the organization has been amazing. If you were following the event, you know that it was held in a 15th century building, the Town Hall of Leuven. Amazing, impressive building, history-wise, art-wise. It's been beautiful. Also, I had the chance to work with a lot of nice people, a lot of great people. So I really love being there, but you are here for the chess, so I will start talking about some chess games. I thought to pick some of the games I love there. There has been many good games, so it was difficult for me to choose. But in the end, I picked 3 of my favorite games for you that we will study today and hopefully learn many instructive details from those games. We will begin with the game of the world champion who won the event. So this is not the game I meant. I will change to the game I meant. It is Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces against Vishy Anand. Perhaps you've seen this game, but we will go move by move through this game and see what can we learn, what should we learn from this amazing game by the world champion who won the Leuven Grand Chess Tour in a very impressive style. He was the only player who outstood from the field. The other players, there were several players who had good tournament but not an excellent tournament, and especially surprising was to see that Hikaru Nakamura, who won in Paris, had a very bad tournament in Leuven, which was just a week later than the Paris event. So you see that these top players, even they suffer from time to time. They have good shapes, bad shapes, even when there are only a few days, a week, a few weeks between those tournaments. So let's see what happened in this game by Magnus Carlsen against Vishy Anand. It starts out with this solid Italian opening, the Gioco Piano on the other name, and we have seen this line in many games, so I'm not going to talk about this. I'm sure that you have learned a lot about this opening from Jan in his opening clinics. What we will focus on is, of course, the middle game as usual, but already with this move, we will start talking about this position a bit because knight a3 looks like weird. So if you don't play the Italian and you're not familiar with this maneuver, let's just see where this knight is heading to. Obviously, you don't want to leave the knight on a3, that would be just really ugly. We are going somewhere with the knight, but it's not to b5 nor to c4. So what we are about to do with this knight is a long knight maneuver. Knight a3, knight c2, and then knight e3, and from e3 we can either go to d5 or jump to f5. Both of those squares are very important in this pawn structure. You see that we have a pawn on e4, black has a pawn on e5, so very symmetrical pawn structure, but both players are fighting for squares like the d5 square and the f5 square if you are white, and if you are black you might want to land your knight on f4, not on d4 in this position, but f4, that's an important square. So our knight is heading towards e3. Knight e7 was played because this black knight is doing the same, so black is going to g6 with the knight and then to f4. As I said, that's an important square. If you manage to actually carry out this maneuver, then the knight will be super annoying for the opponent's king. Just imagine the black knight on f4, our king is on g1. There can be some tactical motives already in the air because of this knight on f4. But we shall see what the world champion did. Knight c2, we are continuing the plan, and after castle, this is the first time you will need to think because yes, I told you that we are heading to e3 with the knight, but let's just see how to carry out this plan in accordance with the rest of the pieces. So we could jump to e3 with the knight right now, or we could think about how we want to develop the rest of the pieces, especially a certain minor piece. So tell me, what would you play in this position first? If not knight e3, what other move could be the right move? If you think about developing the rest of the pieces, where shall each piece go? I'll give you some time to think about this. Alright, let's discuss this because most of you, if not all of you, have said bishop g5, which is a tempting move. But let's just see if it makes much sense in this position or not. In many positions, we would want to pin the knight with bishop g5. You see this knight on f6, the queen on d8. Yeah, there's a knight on e7, but why not bishop g5? We are threatening bishop takes f6, destroying the opponent's pawn structure. The problem with bishop g5 in this position is that it's not really helping us here. Let me show you why. This knight, the e7 knight, is coming from c6, remember, it's heading to g6, so knight from c6 to e7, from there to g6, that's a fine piece on g6, about to jump to f4 later, and the knight from g6 is not only controlling the f4 square, but also the h4 square, so after knight g6, we are not threatening anymore bishop takes because it's just queen takes f6. We haven't achieved anything. We just gave up the dark squared bishop. And yes, there is a pin, but it's only for one more move because the next move, let's just make one move, any move with white. Black will play h6, forcing this bishop to go somewhere. And as I said, the knight from g6 is controlling the h4 square, so we cannot keep up the pin. If we cannot keep it up and we have to exchange on f6, or lose a tempo by moving the bishop back somewhere on e3 for instance, then it was just really pointless to play bishop g5. I know it's a tempting move, so I'm not criticizing anybody who played bishop g5. I'm just telling you guys that in this position bishop g5 is a very natural looking, very tempting move that is not the best. In chess, it happens many times that a move that looks just such an attractive move, it turns out to be not so useful a few moves later. So in this position, bishop g5 could make sense. We are threatening to capture on f6. But after knight g6, you end up having a bishop on g5 that will be chased away with the move h6. And then there's no pin and we don't want to capture on f6. So if we know that the knight is heading to g6 and our bishop will be chased away from g5, then let's not lose time by playing bishop g5. Let's skip playing bishop g5 and place the bishop somewhere else, somewhere where it could be useful. And that square, the only square, is bishop e3. You might wonder if we wanted to exchange this bishop on a7. In this position, yes, in these Italian kind of positions, you will see bishop e3 played by white and you will see bishop e6 played by black. Because If those bishops are not exchanged, then this bishop is very annoying. It's targeting the f2 square. We can never really advance this pawn, or if we want to advance it, we have to move king h1, then f4, and still the bishop will be very annoying on the a7 g1 diagonal. So in order to get rid of this annoying piece, we will, most of the times, if not all the time, play bishop e3. And this was actually the move Magnus Carlsen played, and after bishop takes, of course, you will have 10 seconds to tell me how would you take back, with the knight or with the pawn. 10 seconds, not more, because this is not a difficult question. Good job everyone, it is of course the knight. We were heading to e3, so why not take back on e3 with the knight? That was our plan. In other positions, you will see that f takes e3 also makes sense, but not here. In other games, actually in the next game, you will see this pawn structure where white captures on e3, doubles the pawns in order to open the f5 for his rook. But in this position, it's not in harmony with the rest of our pieces, especially this knight on c2, which is really poor at the moment and will be poor unless we find some miracle maneuver for it. This knight was heading to e3 and it lost its path. We can try to go towards b4, but even from b4, knight d5, it's not what we wanted. So that can easily be parried if it's a threat. Knight d5, black can just push c6, or a5 in this position, anything, but the knight on c2 will suffer. So let's not forget about our plan. We played knight a3, knight c2 in order to get our knight to e3. So once we have the chance, we will of course play knight e3. I want to add to the previous position after bishop e3 that of course we were not afraid of knight g4. This was mentioned by Isaac in the comments. Thank you for talking about this line as well. If knight g4, we can just capture on a7. This rook, first of all, is not well placed on on a7, sorry. So this is an exchange that favors us, and later we can also push d4. If not immediately, then preparing it with rook e1, and we are playing for pushing d4, gaining more space in the center, gaining more control in the center. So bishop e3, bishop takes e3, knight takes e3 was played in the game, and knight g6, everything looks normal. Actually in this game, what I like about Magnus Carlsen's games many times is that for most of the game, you will feel like the opponent's position is fine. And also in this game, what you will see is that Magnus is playing basically an equal position for the whole time. But he will manage to put pressure, even more pressure, and then even more pressure on Anand. And that's why he will eventually collapse and make mistakes. So this is actually an equal position, no miracle lines, no advantage. This is just the position he loves playing because, yes, it's equal, but it's not a dead draw position. So he plays a5, and when he visited us that day in the commentary booth, he told us that when he pushed a5, he was already hoping that this pawn on a5 will eventually give him some advantage later, like 10-50 moves later. This pawn will be very annoying for black, and he was right. So by pushing a5, he's gaining space on the queen side, and he doesn't allow the b7 pawn to be advanced to b6 or b5. It is just restricting this b7 pawn, and later when our queen will go to b3, we will always be attacking this b7 pawn. So that will restrict black's pieces too, because if you have to be protecting this b7 pawn, that means you are not free, you are not able to either develop the bishop, or you have to use the rook to protect this pawn or the queen. You will soon see in the game how it happened, but this a5 move is something that I think we should learn a lot from, because it doesn't look like a move that changes the universe. It's just a very normal move. He could have played any other move actually. You can go rook e1, you can play queen b3, you can try to prepare d4 by playing queen c2, you can try the knight jumps too, but the most annoying move in this position is a5, because it will, in 10 moves, cause problems for black. Let's see how. Knight g4 was played, and now I want you to think once again how to respond to this move. So, we either have the option of capturing this knight, let me know if you like that move, or we can ignore this knight on g4. About ignoring the knight on g4, just you should definitely think whether you want this capture to happen on e3 or not. So, shall we capture on g4, or shall we allow black take on e3? And if we want him to take on e3, shall we force him to take on e3? I think these are the three main options you should consider, and I give you some time for this. Very good job, guys. First of all, most of you have pointed out immediately that we don't really want to capture on g4, because why to capture? If we take on g4, we only have the opponent develop his pieces. That's not something that we want to do in chess. Let's help our own pieces and not the opponent's pieces. Knight takes g4 is a move that just forces black to put his bishop in a good square. Bishop g4, this is an annoying pin. And even if black is not winning anything in this position, black is not better, but still, why did we capture on g4? No idea, not a good move. So, very good conclusion, let's not capture on g4. And secondly, you also noted that we actually want black to take the knight on e3, because after f takes e3, we would open the f file for the rook. This is what I was talking about before, in the moment when black took on e3, and we could have captured with the f-pawn, but then we have this very misplaced knight on c2. So no, in that position f takes e3 was not good, but it doesn't mean that later, some moves later after knight g4 here, we would not want to take f takes e3. So yes, if we want to play f takes e3, then yes, we want to force black capture on e3. And the way to force him is by playing h3. So congratulations everybody, because you are a great audience. You all said that we want him to capture on e3, and h3 is the way to force black capture the knight. So what happens after h3? Knight takes e3, f takes e3. The pawn structure has changed. that means that we should have a look at what has been altered in the position. We have a semi-open f5. That's great because we have this bishop on c4 targeting the f7 square, and now our rook has an open file without having moved the rook. We only castled and the rook is already active. These are the pros. Of course, the negative part is that we had to double our pawns, but we will soon see that sometimes even isolated doubled pawns can be okay. And this is not even isolated doubled pawns. We have doubled pawns, but they are in a group of other pawns. Those are all one pawn island, these pawns. Especially just focus on these central pawns. These pawns, thanks to these pawns, we have the f file, and thanks to these pawns, we control a bunch of squares in the center. You know that the center is the most important part of the board. So if you control a lot of central squares, that can only mean something good in chess. Usually, having these double pawns in the center is good, unless black can attack these pawns. So just make sure that if you go for this, in this position, it's good. We have the open f5, we control a lot of squares in the center, but just make sure that you are not dropping those pawns, because the e3 pawn, for instance, could be a potential weakness if black could place his pieces like queen g5, or if there was a bishop on a7. That would completely change the evaluation of the position. In this case, he cannot. So our pawn is safe, it will not be won. Of course, we can also protect it if it could be attacked, but just in general, whenever you are about to double pawns, make sure that since it changes the pawn structure, you take into account whether your pawn will be weak or it's okay to have doubled pawns. In this position, it's just very fine to have doubled pawns. Queen e7 was played, and now a move that I already mentioned some moves ago when Magnus played a5, that after a5 we will want to place the queen on b3. Not only that we are targeting f7 with this semi-open f file, this can be very dangerous suddenly, that if our knight jumps away from f3, just somewhere, imagine the knight is not on f3, we will already be attacking the f7 pawn with 3 pieces. We are not winning yet, but still it is something to have in mind, that we are just eyeing this pawn on f7 that is close to the black king. So f7 is a target, and the b7 pawn, because after queen b3 it is very difficult for black to develop his pieces. He cannot just move the bishop like bishop d7, because we are very happy to capture this b7 pawn. Let's just make sure we are not blundering our queen. The queen has where to go. We can capture another pawn on c7, and even if black takes on b2, we have taken 2, he has only taken 1. That means that we are more than fine after eliminating this dangerous rook on the second rank. Don't allow your opponent have such an active rook. Let's exchange that, but we are a pawn up in this position. We could also mention other positions where the bishop goes like to e6. That's a different story. Then we might have to take on e6 and then on b7. But I don't really want to go into variations. What I want you to understand mainly is that a5, thanks to a5 and now queen b3, we are restricting black's options a lot. He cannot just develop his bishop easily. He has to think about this pawn on b7. He has to think about the pawn on f7 as well, because of the semi-open f file and these bunch of pieces that are eyeing the f7 pawn. So it's getting a bit inconvenient for black to play this position. Vishy played c6, very normal. So now his queen will be defending both of these weaknesses in black's camp, and he is about to develop his bishop. d4 was played, and this is actually a moment when you should calculate. So you can only play d4 if you have calculated the line that I'm about to ask you about. d4 is a push that we want to make. We want to expand in the center. Sometimes with these double pawns it's not so easy, but d4 should be okay here if we are not dropping the e4 pawn, because after d3 this e4 pawn is unprotected. So you need to calculate what happens if black goes e takes d4. how shall we react? Are we just losing the pawn? We capture on d4 and then queen takes e4. So e takes d4, e takes d4, and here you should tell me what happens after queen takes e4. I'll give you a bit of time to calculate that variation. Wow, there are some very sharp tacticians out there in our group. Well done everybody who spotted the tactics after queen takes e4. Let's just go through them. Queen takes e4 is a very bad move. It's a blunder because of bishop takes f7. This is the most forced. I'm not saying that this is the only move, but this is the most forced variation and it's a beautiful variation. So bishop takes f7, check, rook takes f7, and now queen takes f7, check. The king has to capture it, and after knight g5 we are winning the queen back on e4. This is a fork, double check, discover check, everything in one. We are taking the queen back on e4, and that will mean an exchange up. It's important that in this position after rook takes f7 we don't go knight g5 because it is tempting. It seems to be winning. It looks like we either win the queen or we capture on f7 and it's all over. But in this position there's still a move that we have to consider. It is bishop e6. Just remember that when you sacrifice material, so in this position we are actually a piece down, we have sacrificed the piece, you need to take into account that your opponent might sacrifice some of the material too. So he's a piece up, he can actually give back some of this material or all of it in order to save his position. So bishop e6 is just the move that would give the piece back. We have to take this with the knight, for instance, then we are not attacking the rook anymore. If we take with the queen, we are exchanging queens, and if we capture the queen, then our queen is hanging too, so this is a piece down. That's horrible. Just make sure that when you calculate these force variations, when you want to win material by sacrificing something, bishop takes f7, very good intuition, but whenever we calculate these lines, we should make sure that the opponent doesn't have any defending moves that we might have missed, because that could ruin the whole art of work that we created on the chessboard. So after rook takes f7, find the most forced variation, and forced lines are about checks, captures, and threats, mainly mate threats. So those three type of moves are the most forcing moves in chess. And here, of course, queen takes f7, a check and a capture at the same time. This is the best variation. If it works, you should go for these forced checks. Check, check, check. That always means that the opponent doesn't have many options to actually go for a line that you haven't seen, because if it's a check, he has to respond to the check. So I guess that's more than clear. I've been talking a lot about this, but this is a beautiful line I wanted to show you after d4. So if e takes d4, e takes d4, we have straightened the pawn structure, and our pawn on e4 is untouchable because of the tactical motive on f7, together with knight g5 that would win the queen back. So e takes d4 for black doesn't make sense, because it just helps us to have a very healthy pawn structure. This is a beautiful pawn structure. Now we don't have any problems, no doubled pawns. We still have an open f file, semi-open f file, beautiful center, many squares under control, very good pieces. This is a nice position for white, not a nice position for black. So after d4, Vichy didn't take on d4, but played bishop e6. He wants to exchange this bishop, very logical. And now after bishop takes, we should do something about the bishop. So Magnus opted for taking on e6. If queen takes e6, you know that this pawn is in the air. We just need to make sure that we are not blundering our queen. We have where to go with the queen. Queen takes c6, and black can't even take the pawn on b2 because his rook on a8 would be hanging. If he goes to b8 with the other rook, then we even have the option of capturing this a6 pawn. And when you see a position like this and you have the option of capturing either the c6 pawn or the a6 pawn, of course you should also have in mind that you want the pawn that allows you to have a passed pawn. If we capture on c6, that's also a fine move, but we have already advanced our pawn to a5. So if you can eliminate this black pawn on a6, that means that you have a very dangerous passed pawn, and that means more than a pawn up, more than 2 pawns up. This is a horribly strong pawn about to be promoted. So just always think which pawn has more value to you. In this position, the c6 pawn is less valuable to white than the a6 pawn. Let's go back to the moment when Magnus captures on e6, because of course Vichy didn't take with the queen. He wants to keep his pawn safe, so he goes f takes e6. And now if you look at the pawn structure, you see that it's so weird. We have 4 pawns on the e file. That's not something you see every day. Doubled pawns for both white and black. They have both opened the f file thanks to these doubled pawns. They control a lot of squares in the center because they have the same pawn structure. Pawns on e4, e3, pawns on e5 and e6. So what is the difference between the two camps? The difference is not these central pawns. The difference is what mainly Magnus achieved by playing a5 way back in move. What move was that? He played a5 on move 10 something. At the very early stage of the game, Magnus Carlsen pushed his pawn to a5 because he knew that he wanted to grab more space on the queen side in order to have to create a backward pawn for black on b7. This is a pawn that is a backward pawn. It cannot be pushed. It is a weakness, and black always has to keep an eye on it. He always has to protect it with a piece. So that is not like a huge difference between white's and black's position, but it is certainly a difference that makes white's position favorable, and that's why black should be defending here and not white. We have this beautiful pawn on a5 restricting the black pawns on the queen side, and after queen b3 putting pressure on the b7 pawn and also on the e6 pawn. Why I'm drawing so many arrows? I hope you can still see the board. So we are putting pressure on the weaknesses in black's camp because the e6 pawn can also be weak and is weak if we are attacking it. Unlike the e3 pawn, which is pretty safe, it can hardly be attacked. There's no queen g5, there's no knight jump. This pawn on e3 is safe. The pawn on e6 is attacked by the queen on b3. and also the backward b7 pawn. Lots of talking from me, let's just make the moves. Rook a d1, of course, developing the rook, and why not to bring it to a fight that might be open. If we capture on e5, we are opening the file for the rooks, for the d1 rook, so you always want to have a rook on either an open file or on a file that is about to be opened. You don't want to place your rook on weird squares like e1 in this case, or on c1, places where it's unlikely that your rook will ever have any activity. This c file or the e file are not about to be opened. Unless the pawn is hanging on e3, we will not play rook e1. So rook a d1 is a lot more logical. We are hoping to take on e5 at some point and open the d5 for the rook. After rook a e8, Magnus goes queen b4, which is once again with the same idea in mind. This queen is annoying on b4. After rook a e8, black is overprotecting the e6 pawn, so it's not like we will have something against this pawn. There's the queen, there's also the black rook. They are both defending this pawn. So let's forget about the e6 pawn. Let's look for other weaknesses in the position. And another weakness besides the b7 pawn is the d6 pawn, because it is not protected by another pawn. It is only the black queen that is protecting it. So by playing queen b4, Magnus doesn't allow black move away with the black queen. It has to stay on e7. It has to be protecting both pawns. And that's very annoying for a queen, because queens are not supposed to be protecting pawns. Queens are supposed to be active, attacking. You want to give mate with the queen. You don't want to be protecting pawns with the queen. So queen b4 is a very strong move. And this is the position where black shall already take some decisions. He cannot just sit and wait. He doesn't really have useful moves. And in chess, when you don't have more useful moves, that's bad. How can you improve the position without having useful moves? Not easy at all. So Vishy takes on d4. Here, I will let you think whether you would take back on d4 with the c pawn or the e pawn. It's one of the pawns, not a piece. But shall we take on d4 with the pawn or from c3 or with the pawn from e3? Let's see what you think. I see that this is a position that really divided our audience. I see many votes for c takes d4, others say e takes d4. Actually, both of these moves make a lot of sense. But in this position, if we think about how Magnus Carlsen was carrying out the whole plan about playing a5, queen b3, queen b4, always restricting the opponent's options. So if you know that Magnus likes a lot to restrict the opponent's possibilities, that means that he is not happy about giving away squares that could be important, that could be potentially an outpost for the opponent's pieces. And the move I'm talking about by saying a potential outpost is e takes d4. That's a move that would straighten the pawn structure. So yeah, normally we would love to have a healthy pawn structure, everything in its place, beautiful center, more space, very good pieces. But this move has given up the f4 square. And that is something that Magnus would not like, because that means that this knight from g6 could have actually an active square. It could jump to f4 right now. And the knight on f4, as I said in the opening, that's a cool place for the knight. This means that in the future, for instance, but it's annoying in itself, but in the future, just imagine if black manages to bring his queen to g6, because a queen on g6 would threaten mate on g2. A queen on g6 would threaten knight takes h3 check because of the pin. That would be horribly annoying, and even without the queen on g6, this knight on f4 is annoying in itself because we can never chase it away. We cannot play g3 because the pawn on h3 would be hanging. We cannot play moves like, I don't know, rook c1 because there are forks all the time. Not that we want to go rook c1 here, but I'm just trying to demonstrate that this knight on f4 is annoying. So if you can prevent your opponent from placing a knight on such a disturbing square for us, then let's prevent it. That's why the move c takes d4 is better here, and that's what Magnus chose. So yes, we cannot straighten the pawn structure, that's the disadvantage of c takes d4, but we do have control of the f4 square, and that is great because it means that the knight on g6 is kinda silly. It's not going anywhere. The maximum it could do is to be exchanged on h4, but remember that the queen cannot abandon the e7 square, so black cannot really go knight h4 because he has to be protecting with his queen those pawns on b7 and on d6. So if the knight cannot jump to f4, if it cannot go to h4, that means that this is quite an awkward piece on g6. It is misplaced, it is not doing anything on g6. That's why c takes d4 is a great move. We don't give the option of knight f4 to the opponent. I don't know how much you can hear from what's going on here, but I think a storm is about to begin here in Spain, so I hope it's not disturbing much the lesson. People are getting ready for the rain. In Spain it's not very normal that it rains, so yeah, it's like a panic situation. Oh my, we have to close the balconies and such. So that's what my neighbors are doing, and that is pretty noisy. Anyway, the position is this: c takes d4 and bishop played e5. As I said, it's not easy to play a position where you are passive and you just have to be protecting your pawns, you have to be keeping everything under control, and you don't have a plan yourself, you cannot improve your position. So he takes on d4 and pushes e5 because he needs to create some kind of a counterplay. He cannot just let white to improve his position happily and as slowly as he wishes, because black did not have a plan. He takes on d4, he pushes e5 because he is creating counterplay. He wants to threaten e takes d4, and he wants to target the e4 pawn, which, as I said, is a double pawn that doesn't have a companion. It is not protected by any pawns, so if the e file opens, that means that our pawn on e4 will suffer. So what shall we do after e5 by black? How can we prepare for this e takes d4? What shall we do against it if we should prevent it? Let's see. What do you think? Good job, everyone! Yes, we should do something against e takes d4, and there are two ways of preventing e takes d4. One is to push d5, that's a good move, and the other is what Magnus played, that's another good move, d takes e5. So whether you push d5 or you play d takes e5, but you need to prevent black from capturing on d4. So let me just show you with any random move. Let's just play like rook d2. If we allow e takes d4, after e takes d4, queen takes e4. Yes, I said that the queen had to be on e7 protecting these pawns, but not anymore. It's not the case anymore because black has just captured an pawn on e4 and he's activating his queen. So this is a position where, yes, we would still have material equality on the board. We both captured a pawn each, but the black queen has become very active. The e file is open, the f file is open, the knight is about to jump to f4, or it can also go to h4. This is a position where black would have the initiative, so this is definitely something we need to prevent. We cannot allow black activate his queen and the rest of his pieces, because you see that once the position opens up, suddenly black has excellent pieces. The rook's on the open files, queen in the center, knight about to jump to f4 or to h4. All the black pieces are great, so this is something that we cannot allow. After e5, we should push d5 or take on e5. As I said, both are good, but let's see why Magnus took on e5, which kinda looks like a horrible move if we see the pawns that stay on the board. Doubled pawns, and not only doubled pawns, but isolated pawns. Those double pawns before, they used to have a company. There used to be a pawn on d3, then it was on d4, but those were like a kind of a bunch of pawns together, a group of friends standing nearby, protecting each other, controlling squares together. That was good. But now these are isolated pawns, isolated doubled pawns. And in most of the positions, I would say that this is horrible. Me as my strategy, when I see isolated double pawns, I'm like, oh, jeez, how could you? This normally in chess is horribly weak to have isolated double pawns because there's no pawn defending them and they are not helping each other either. This is just a pawn on e3 and another pawn on e4. But in this position, in this very position, it is okay. Why it is okay? Because after having played d takes e5, we have opened the d file, we already had the f file, and these pawns, the e3 pawn and the f4 pawn, are still controlling important squares. The knight cannot jump to f4, we control other important squares too in the center, and mainly what is important, very important, is that the white pieces are very active. So we will see if we exchange queens or not, that I will talk about later, but just look at the rooks, they both have open files, the queen is targeting weaknesses in black's camp, and the knight is also attacking this e5 pawn. While black's pieces are not attacking neither the e3 pawn nor the e4 pawn, and that's good news. So if in this position, as I said, black would be capable of attacking either the e3 pawn or the e4 pawn efficiently with many pieces. Imagine that he starts attacking one of these pawns with many pieces. The pawn would drop, we would lose the pawn. That would be very bad news. But in this position, it's not possible. So a weakness is weakness. How shall I put it? Those pawns would be weak if they could be attacked. But since black cannot attack them, they are fine. This position would be horrible if there was no pawn on e5. Imagine we take away this e5 pawn for the b2 pawn. Okay, let's just get rid of those pawns from the board. No e5 pawn, no b2 pawn. That means that our pawns on e4 and e3 would be horrible. That means that isolated double pawns most of the times are very bad because they cannot protect themselves. They are just very poor pawns and vulnerable pawns. But thanks to the pawn on e5, there's no e file, and also black cannot attack our pawns with moves like queen g5 or queen c5, or I don't know, the knight cannot attack it, the rooks cannot attack them. So in this very position, it is okay to have isolated double pawns, and thanks to these isolated double pawns, our pieces are very active. So after d takes e5, Magnus even exchanged queens, so he's not about to give mate. He has this structural weakness of the double pawns, but as I said, he has the open files and the initiative, better pieces, active pieces, and it's very important that in this position it is him who can decide how the game will continue. He plays rook d6, he starts putting even more pressure on his opponent, and if you look at this position, you see that black's pawn structure is very healthy, but at the same time, his pieces are very passive. Let's just look at the pieces one by one. The rook on e7, the only task that this rook carries out is to be protecting pawns. Especially, well, it's protecting the e5 pawn. Later on, the b7 pawn could be hanging too in a moment, but what you can definitely see is that this rook is passive. Another bad piece is the knight on g6, because we are not allowing the knight to jump to f4 nor to h4. So what is this knight doing on g6? It doesn't have anywhere to go. It doesn't look like a bad piece on g6, but it is not attacking anything. It has nowhere to go. The only task it carries out is to be protecting the e5 pawn. Once again, wow, we have a rook and a knight protecting pawns. That's pretty sad, because the only good piece black has is the f8 rook. At least it has an open file. Rooks need open file, so this is what he would love to do with his other rook, but he cannot really go rook f7 just like this and forget about his pawns. We'll soon see why. So Vichy decides that he needs a better spot for his knight, and he plays a very awkward looking move, but it makes a lot of sense. The knight on h8 is horrible, but it is heading to f7, and from f7 it will be at least hitting the rook on d6, forcing the rook to leave the d6 square. It is annoying to have a rook on the 6th rank, even more annoying to have it on the 7th, but yeah, the rook on d6 is annoying, so he's going to f7 to attack the rook, and from f7 he can be protecting the pawn. And if we leave with our knight, he could go to g5. So that is what will happen actually. Just look at the position. Magnus is going knight d2 because yes, our position is beautiful, but we need to improve it. So he needs to improve his knight as well. Both knights are about to be maneuvered. They are both searching for a better spot. Knight f7 attacking our rook, so we have to retreat. And after knight g5, you might think that black has achieved a lot of things. It has the knight has been improved. It is attacking the e4 pawn. This rook is fine. Now the only bad piece is the e7 rook. And this is more or less true, but in this position, Magnus finds a very annoying move. So what do you think could be annoying for black here? He's happy, he's about to play perhaps rook f7, doubling the rooks there, forcing the exchange of rooks, or he could capture on f1, then bring his king to e6. Which move do you think could be annoying, the most annoying? Try to find the most annoying move in this position. We cannot move our knight because the pawn on e4 would be hanging. So we should start thinking about how could we maneuver the knight somewhere, and at the same time we should be ready for the exchange of the rooks on the f file. Do we want to allow black capture on f1 just like this, get rid of a pair of rooks, or we have something better against this? Shall we let rook takes f1 happen, or we can do something against it? I don't know if I'm helping with my questions or I'm just making you confused, but I hope that you can guess the most annoying move in this position for white. Well done everyone, it is indeed rook f5, the right move, because we are preparing for the exchange of rooks, but look how we want to exchange rooks. If black wants to get rid of the rook, he has to capture on f5, and after e takes f5, we have straightened our pawn structure. We don't have these weak doubled pawns anymore, and we are about to push e4. So if black goes, let's say, any random move, h5, we will just push e4, bring the king to e3 to protect the e4 pawn, and then we can activate the knight as well. This pawn on e5 will be always weak, the pawn on b7 will still be weak. We have a very healthy pawn structure, better pieces, and black will still be very passive without even being able to say that we have doubled pawns. One question in the chat that I have seen is if Magnus is actually better here. He has a tiny little advantage. So this is a position that we could say that it is very close to be equal. But that's why I'm showing you the game, because I want you to see that just because a position is equal or very close to equal, you don't have to offer draw to your opponent. We are learning from Magnus Carlsen how to squeeze water out of stone, how to get step by step something out of a position that is not so promising. It just looks kind of equalish. We have the initiative, we have just played rook f5, we are making annoying moves, and that's the point. So we should find annoying moves. Rook f5, not rook f6. Rook f5 is very annoying because black cannot take this. He shouldn't straighten our pawn structure. Just one more line that I wanted to show is that after rook takes f5, e takes f5, e4 would be a horrible blunder because we have a check on d8, and after h4 the knight is trapped on g5, so he cannot even prevent our pushing e4 after e takes f5. Rook f5, very annoying move, and you guys have found it. So if he cannot capture the rook on f5, he has to do something about the knight on g5, right? He doesn't want to go anywhere with the knight, so he protects it. But as I said, we have solved the f5 problem. Black will never really take on f5 because it only helps us. But we would love to improve the d2 knight. That knight is not supposed to be on d2. We want to carry out maneuvers. We want to either go to c4 or maybe even better to b3 and to c5 with this knight. But we cannot go away because the black knight is attacking our pawn on e4. So what shall we do in order to start a knight maneuver? How can we get a position where we can move the knight? Seems like that was an easy question, but I'm very proud of you guys. Anyway, h4 is the right move. You guys have said it. All of you have said h4. Yes, let's chase the knight away from g5. We want to move the knight. We want to improve our knight. So let's tell the other knight, go back. Go back either to... Where shall it go? Actually, if you look at this position, where can the black knight move? The options are very restricted. He cannot go to e6 because the pawn would be hanging on e5. It can only be moved either to f7 or to h7. But both of them look pretty ugly. Knight f7, in that case we just start maneuvering with our knight, improve our position. And the knight from f7, yes, it is on f7, yes, it's not hanging, yes, it is defending the e5 pawn, but this is a position where all the black pieces are passive and you can't really find a way to improve them. That's why Vichy went knight h7, which might look weird, but at least the knight is heading somewhere. He wants to place the knight on f6. From there it would be attacking once again the e4 pawn and not restrict so much the rooks. So knight h7 at least has an idea to place the knight on f6, but We needed just one tempo to improve our knight, because in this very moment the e4 pawn is not hanging. So let's start carrying out a knight maneuver. We go knight b3, and when the knight arrives on f6, just in time, we play knight c5. So from this position, have a look at this position where the black knight was on g5 and the white knight on d2. We achieve a position where our knight is on c5 and the black knight on f6. Our knight has improved a lot. The knight on c5 is brilliant. It is not only protecting the e4 pawn, but it is targeting the b7 backward pawn, the weakness in black's camp, and at the same time it controls many important squares like d7 and e6. So we don't allow black activate his rook by playing rook d7 ever, or maneuver his king to e6 to protect the e6 to protect the e5 pawn from e6. So the knight on c5 is just ideal. You couldn't find a better spot for the knight in this position. Well, unless we imagine that our knight is on g6 winning a rook, but that's a different story. So positionally the knight on c5 is great. That's the best spot you could ever have for this knight. And after rook f7, black is trying to hold on. He's trying to have everything protected, try to maneuver his pieces. Now Magnus pushes h5, so it kind of happens just like what happened on the queen side, that there's this a5 pawn restricting black's pawn, queen side pawns. There are 2 white pawns on the queen side restricting 3 black pawns. So there can be no push. He can never push the b pawn. The c pawn is blocked. The a pawn is blocked. Black's pawns are paralyzed on the queen side, and now he's doing the same on the king side, h5, making sure that black can never really push g6. And if he cannot open more files, it means that his rooks will be doomed to passivity all the time. He cannot activate his king, he cannot activate the rooks, he cannot move the knight. This position is getting really, really annoying. This is still a position where the computer says, this is nothing, it's just 0, 15, maximum 0, 20. So that's a position that you should be able to hold. You should be able to make a draw in these kind of positions where the engine says that the advantage is just minimal. But in practice, this position is lost because you cannot move your pieces, you don't have counterplay, you cannot activate your pieces, and let's not forget, you're playing against the world champion. So on top of that, on top of all the bad things that are happening to black here, white is Magnus Carlsen, and he is brilliant at this kind of chess, just improving his position little by little, getting a full point out of nothing. So we had a very equalish position with weird looking pawns, and now look at white's position, all his pieces are active. He is paralyzing black's position. Let's see what happened later. King h7, rook d8, just to make sure that the king will not even, it can never go back to the back rank. Yes, I found the word. The rook is restricting the king. The rook is restricting also the rooks, the black rooks. There's no rook f8 ever, no rook e8 ever. If you look at this position now, really after king h7, maybe that was the last mistake, but we can't really call Bish's move a mistake because his position was already unpleasant. So it's not like a blunder, but perhaps king h7 is the last move that makes black's position just really, really unpleasant. After rook d8, he barely has legal moves on the board, or moves that would not lose material. As I said, he can never go rook e8. This knight is pinned, so it's not only about the pawn. He can never take back there. The rook on f7 is hanging. He can never go rook f8. He can never go rook d7, rook c7. He has to be protecting this pawn, and he actually is running out of moves. And that is what will happen. After g6, he's trying to get space. He's trying to escape from this position. We take on g6, and after king takes g6, this is the last moment where you should really focus on the position and see what does black want, and also find a solution for it, how to prevent it. Let's keep on paralyzing black's pieces. Find a way to restrict black's position once again and forever. So let's restrict his position as much as possible. How does he want to activate his pieces, with what move, and how shall we prevent it? This is your task and we are about to win the game, so this is basically the last question you need to answer. Well done, everybody, of course. Well, of course or not of course, but you definitely found the right move, which is rook d6, pinning the knight. The threat wasn't knight takes e4, this pawn cannot be captured, but still, you should watch out for the knight jumps. If we just play any random move, let's make b3 for instance, black will just jump to g4 with the knight, threaten to exchange pieces. That's annoying because we want him to be paralyzed, we don't want him to get rid of the pieces, and the knight on g4 is finally a good piece. It is attacking our weak pawn. This is when you see that the isolated doubled pawns can be very weak. The e3 pawn is horribly weak in this position and black has found a way to attack it. So we cannot allow knight g4 happen because it will lead to the exchange of rooks. It will lead to this e3 pawn being very weak. That's why after king takes g6, rook d6 is a very important move, and now once again we are paralyzing black's pieces because king g7 to get out of the pin. Now we go knight e6 check, and when the king goes back, here actually white could capture on e5. This is the move we thought that Magnus wanted to play in the commentary when we were talking about this position with Jan. But after rook takes e5, we are a pawn up and we are happy. But black can still fight. He can breathe at least. Rook d7 exchanges a rook. Magnus doesn't allow it. He says, you know what? I don't want your e5 pawn. What I want is that you run out of legal moves. I want your position to be paralyzed. So he goes knight d8. It looks weird, but it is attacking the rook and it will be targeting the b7 pawn. So black plays rook f8. This is what he has to do, only move. And now, last question. What would you play here in order to just tell black that find a move if you can? We have a brilliant rook, we have another brilliant rook. The knight on d8 is annoying because it takes away lots of squares and it is attacking the b7 pawn. Just tell me one more move, yet another move that could improve the position and basically restrict all the possibilities of black. See which piece he can move in this position, there are not many, and how to restrict those few options that black still has. Let's see. Good job, everyone. You found the right move. Actually, there are two moves that are in the spirit of the position and in the spirit of let's paralyze all the black pieces. So if you look at this position, you see that the knight is pinned. If the knight is pinned, that the rooks cannot move either. The king cannot go anywhere either. Only the pawns can move. So whether you play b4, very good move, or you go g4, that's what Magnus played, but the idea is the same. You just tell the opponent that, hey, do you have any moves? Like, can you move anything? So then Vishy, of course, realizes, I guess he must have realized moves ago that in this position he's lost, because the only move that was not losing any material in this position was pushing c5, and after c5 he played the other move that you guys were suggesting, b3. And if you look at the board now and you try to find a move for black that doesn't lose material, I mean, if you find one, then you're a genius, because in this position you cannot move the king, you cannot move any of the rooks, the knight is pinned, and the pawns are blocked or paralyzed. So this is a Zugzwang. Black has no possible way of holding the position. Just try, really try for a second and look at the position and try to move one of the black pieces. Just try to find one that is possible to move. I'll give you 3 seconds for it. And if somebody is a genius, please tell me in the chat that there is a move for black. Let me see. Can you find any moves for black? Any move that doesn't lose material? I will wait for the answer. I'll be patient. I see Facepalm chat saying that it's crazy that it was a blitz game. Actually, they played this game in the rapid event, but still it doesn't take away any of the value of the game. The blitz was 25 minutes plus 10 seconds, but they have played plenty of moves already. So at this stage of the game, they only had a few minutes left on the clock. Okay, Ambitious Pawn says that the king should be turned over, resign. I think that's the right move here. King g7 loses to knight e6, and rook c7, the same problem, knight e6. So, and yeah, Dahai also says that resign doesn't lose material. It is true that in this position, there is no way to keep the game going. Vishy played rook e8, but after knight takes, rook e8, and after knight takes b7, it's not only one pawn that is being dropped, it is also the c5 pawn, and if the knight gets to c5, he will probably lose the knight as well on f6, so everything falls, it's like a domino effect. The b7 pawn drops and then the rest of the black army, so Vishy did resign in this position. I hope that you like this game. It was really an example of how to squeeze water out of stone, how to improve your position in equalish positions. So all I want you to understand from this game, of course we cannot play this deep as the world champions, as Magnus Carlsen does, but we should try to understand that even equalish positions can be enjoyed. You don't have to offer a draw to your opponent just because it looks like the position is boring. You can always try to find tiny details like this a5 push he played in the opening, or doubling the pawns in order to open files. Any tiny difference that you can make from your position, between your position and the opponent's position. Just try to make the position have something, a tiny little detail that doesn't make it a mirror position, that doesn't make it completely symmetrical, and then you can play for something. So I believe that from Magnus Carlsen's games we can learn a lot from these deep positional thinking, that he understood where his pieces had to go, he did not fear having isolated doubled pawns, and he just managed to paralyze Vishy Anand's pieces. A former world champion playing with the black pieces, running out of moves with so many pieces on the board. He doesn't have any moves that doesn't lose material. So that, I think, is a huge achievement from an equal position. But those of you who are bored by my positional examples, I love positional games. I have two more games, two more positions, because we will not go through the whole games. These are a lot more sharp, and there will be tactical blows. So I have chosen Magnus's game for a long, instructive positional example, a model game on how to win an equal position, an equal looking position, a boring looking position. But I do have two more examples where you will enjoy sacrificing. So this is Fabiano Caruana against Veselin Topalov, and it is a position where you might think that black is fine, and it is true, but there's some danger, and after rook f2, Topalov goes wrong. Of course, he cannot take on d3, because then after rook takes, bishop takes f6. This position is horrible. We are threatening mate on g7. The pawn on e5 is hanging. This is bad. So, of course, he realizes it, but there are two ways of protecting the pawn on f6. One is to go rook f7, and the other is rook d6. So he chooses the wrong one. It wasn't easy, but he had to. He had to go rook f7, I believe. In that case, at least the sacrifice that happens in the game would not work. But it just looks like rook d6 is fine. What's wrong with rook d6? Well, Fabiano doubles on the f5, so once again he's threatening bishop takes f6. And after queen c8, I think here he could have gone just queen g3, but this is a rapid game, so they don't always play the perfect move. The idea, what he found, is still beautiful. So he goes rook f8, rook f5, and after c5, queen g3. Yes, now he realized that he needs the queen on g3, and he's preparing for something. He is threatening bishop takes f6 or rook takes f6 because of the pin. So black goes king h8, and you might think that this position is just very safe for black with the king on h8. What could go wrong? Well, what goes wrong is that Fabiano sacrifices a whole rook. Just like this. Rook takes f6 in a rapid game with only a few minutes on the clock. He goes rook takes f6. But what's the point? After g takes, not bishop takes f6. If he plays bishop takes f6, black will just take, we take, and we are a piece down and not giving mate. That is for sure. The queen will try to head to the king side, and in best case we give perpetual check. So the idea of rook takes f6 is that after g takes, he just plays rook takes f6. And in this position, I could not believe it when we were commentating this game. He is a full rook down. And yes, there's mate if black captures, but he is not forced to take on f6. So he could go, I don't know, he has many moves. He can go rook from c6 to d7. He can bring the queen. He can play many moves. And none of them really works, at least not for a win for black. So black is a whole rook up, and he, in best case, can achieve a draw. So the draw would have been if he goes queen d7, but I really don't want to go into details here. If you want to analyze it, you can open this game from our database and analyze it in our analysis and coaching menu on Chess24. So just have a look at the queen d7 lines if you want to know how to save this position. But if Topalov couldn't save it, that means that it is horribly difficult to find the best defending moves. He went rook from d8 to d7. If he goes with this rook, I just want to mention that, of course, this position is horrible. We are threatening mate with rook f8, discover check, double check, everything. And after king g8, rook f4, even we are threatening rook g4, we are threatening to capture the rook. If rook g7, this position, it is still a piece down. But just see how many pawns we have for the piece. We have already 4 pawns for the piece. So that means that is worth more than a piece. And at the same time, we keep on attacking. The queen cannot abandon the back rank. The knight is hanging. The pawn on b4 is hanging. This position is losing for black. So that's why he goes rook a d7. But here, after queen takes e5, king g8, these are very precise moves. So I didn't even want to dare asking what would you play here, because I cannot guess these moves. This is a masterpiece, a tactical masterpiece where the point of sacrificing a rook is not to give mate. He is a rook down and he is not about to give mate. The rooks are being exchanged. He is a full rook down for something that looks like a perpetual in best case. He doesn't even have perpetual. Okay, he could try with queen f5, but he's not playing for a draw. So what you should understand here is that he didn't sacrifice a rook to then start giving checks. He sacrificed a rook because he wants to win. And the way to do that is to play bishop g5 because the queen is perfect on e6. It restricts the king a lot. And bishop h6 would be mate. So if we just make any random move for black after bishop h6, he's lost. He can only prevent it with rook g7 when he drops the queen. This is when you see that this position is so dangerous. He is a full rook up. Black is a rook up and he cannot do anything here. He plays queen c7 to get out of the pin, but after bishop h6, of course, he has to give up his rook for the sake of the security of his king. But this is still incredible that here, Fabiano did not have any intention of capturing the rook. If he takes it, then okay, he is just now only a piece down. But whether a queen takes or maybe better king takes, black might survive. So he doesn't want to take this. He goes e5. He is playing the game with a rook down and he is just pushing pawns. I mean, that's a pawn move here, a rook down, and with no mating net, with no attacking pieces. There are 2 white pieces on the board plus this pawn on e5, and this position is winning. So let's see what happened in the game after knight c3. He says, I'm pushing another pawn, I have passed pawns. I'm a rook down, but I'm pushing my passed pawns. d4, c takes, e takes. And here black finally thought, okay, I have to do something. If he goes knight takes a2, that's just bad because of a check. Then e6, and we will eventually take here and win because of the e5 pawn. It marches all the way and it promotes. So yes, e5 had a lot of sense. This pawn is being promoted. If black doesn't do anything, that pawn will march all the way down to e8. That's why Topalov plays queen f7, when after this check, another check, and another check, white is winning. And why is he giving so many checks? It's because with the queen on c8, he cannot take on g7. He wants to take on g7. The idea is to take the rook and then take the pawn on b4 with a check and win the knight. But he cannot do it here. Let me just show you. If bishop takes, queen takes, this is what we want. We go queen b7, the black king has to go to f8, and after queen takes b4, we are winning the knight, we are winning the game. We have like 1,000 pawns up. But this doesn't work. After bishop takes g7, careful, black has perpetual, queen f1 check, and we have just ruined a winning position. This is draw. So that's why after check, he gives another check and another check. And when the queen is ideally placed, he went there with the checks. So very important, when you know where you want your queen and you get there with checks, then you can continue the plan of taking on g7 and just see the difference. If a check comes on f1 and another check on f4, we can play g3 and the queen will go back to g2 to avoid perpetual check. We are like 3 pawns up and winning the endgame. So this is a winning position. This is just how deep these elite players can calculate even with just few minutes on the clock. So Fabiano was a rook down for like 10 moves, he sacrificed the rook, and at the end, when he's winning, he just knew that he has to have his queen on c6. He gets there with a check, then he takes the rook, and this position, as I showed, queen b7 check, forcing king f8, and after queen takes b4, black resigned because he is dropping the piece, and he is like 4 pawns down or 3 pawns down. I cannot even count how many. This position is completely winning. There are no perpetual checks, nothing. So I was amazed by this rook sacrifice, but the other game that amazed me, and it starts from here, not the final position that you have just seen, is Vichy Annen's game from the very first round of the rapid event in Leuven against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, who is a very strong player, calculates very well, and he gets into trouble. Once again, tactics. So watch out for the tactics coming in this game. Knight e4 is a start of a long sequence of moves that Vichy had foreseen. So when he plays knight e4, he knows what's about to come. He knows that bishop h6 will be Maxim's move. Bishop h6, you cannot take this because that's a fork. Oh my, are we losing? Bishop h6, if you cannot capture the bishop, he will capture your pawn. Let's just make a very bad move. Bishop takes g7, threatening a fork with knight h6. The rook is hanging. We have just lost the pawn. Disaster, isn't it disaster? That we have this position, knight e4, bishop h6. Have we blundered? No, Vishy didn't blunder. Vishy wanted white to play bishop h6 because after bishop h6 he goes queen c7. You might have seen this game in the commentary live, or you might have watched the video, but I'm still impressed. So I hope that now together, seeing it move by move, you will learn from how he discovered this tactical motive and how can we exploit such an exposed king. Because just have a look at white's king. g4 is a very committal move, so it was part of the opening that Maxim chose. Of course, it wasn't a mistake, but it has its drawback. The drawback is that the white king is weak, a lot weaker than having the pawn on g2. We wish the pawn would be on g2. Of course, that would mean hanging knight on f5, sorry. But still, if you push g4, it has its consequences. And in this position, after bishop h6, queen c7, if Maxim played knight takes, if he goes bishop takes, we just take the knight on f5, and after knight f4, intermediate move, we will capture on g7. And even if we don't give mate immediately, this position is horrible. We have two minor pieces for the rook. And look at that white king. It has nowhere to hide. We have just so many checks coming, mate in a few moves, basically. Even if it goes to another square, like king h1, then we go knight d3. It cannot be captured because of this fork. Just look at these tactical motives, like knight d3, threatening knight f2. You cannot take it. This is a brilliant position showing the strength of the minor pieces. Two minor pieces against the rook in this position are winning the game because the minor pieces, all of them, are helping and the rook is not doing much on e1. So Maxim played knight takes. The good move is queen b3. You can analyze it. If you find this game, you can analyze queen b3, how it would have saved the game. But after knight takes g7, what Maxim played, the tactical blow is knight takes f2. Has to be taken because the queen is hanging. And now, thanks to this pin, queen h2 check. So we are a piece down, but we are having a very powerful attack. White cannot play king f1 because after, well, I don't even know if queen takes h3 is the best move. It's definitely tempting, but maybe knight h4 is even better. Threatening rook takes f3 and queen g2 mate. This is the best move here. This is completely lost. So the only chance that white has is that he can run away with the king. King e3. And here in the commentary, with Jan, we were discussing the move queen takes h3. Looks very tempting. We are attacking the f3 knight, pinning the knight. But after knight f5, we do have a check, but this king goes back to f2. And in this position, we don't have more checks. And everything is protected. Everything. So suddenly you end up like, oh my, I've just sacrificed a piece and I don't have anything for it, not even perpetual check. I cannot take anything, just a few pawns, but black is a piece down and black is lost here. So you have to be very careful, calculating very precisely. But Vishy, when he played knight e4, he saw all this. He saw that in this position he will go, look at the board and look what he played. Queen to g2. The queen is on h2 and he's a piece down and he just takes the queen and puts it on g2 and he's like, your move. The knight is hanging, rook takes f3, mate is the threat and you cannot do anything. White is lost. Let's see why. The same idea doesn't work here. Knight f5 covering the f5 doesn't work because rook e8 is mate. Basically, you have a few more moves, but the point is that the king is cut. The king cannot go back. No king d2, no king f2 are possible. Knight e5, you just take it. Look at how many pins we had in this game. There was queen h2 because of the pin on the f5. Now rook takes e5 because of the pin along the diagonal. This is mate. queen e4, we take it and it's over. So you cannot play knight f5. What can you do then? You might try rook f1, but this is also something that Vishy calculated. He saw everything, and only after calculating for a few minutes, he saw this all these lines. He would play knight e5 here, and once again, just look at the board. There's a pin on the a7 g1 diagonal, there's a pin on the f file, and there's a king on e3. So normally you don't want to have your king in the center. Knight e5 wins the game because you have to take this. The knight on f3 was hanging, and after rook takes f1, queen f2 mate is just one of the many threats that black has. There's no move here. Queen f2 or queen g3 or queen, depending on what you play here with white, or if queen e2 moves like, well, I don't know which move to play. Many moves are winning. Perhaps this is the shortest, queen e4 and then bishop a5. But even if you don't see the mate, like bishop takes d4 would win the queen, and if king d3, like there are so many good lines. Okay, I might be complicating things, but I just want to show you that even if you don't find the very best move in this position, after rook takes f1, you have many winning moves. What Vishy did see and had to see was knight e5 and queen g2. The only way to win, the queen is hanging on h2. He cannot play queen takes h3. That wasn't winning. He cannot play, maybe rook takes f3. He was calculating, but it's not such a good move either. Queen g2 was the only move that won the game. He is a piece down, and he just makes a tiny little step with the queen from one square to the neighbor square. Queen g2 wins the game. And if queen e2, it's what happened in the game. Rook takes f3, so it's not enough to sacrifice a piece. He's sacrificing now a rook because he's luring the queen to f3, and after queen takes f3, bishop takes d4, deflecting the king from e3, so he's winning a queen. There was just no move here. If queen f1, it's the same thing. After rook takes f3, queen takes, bishop takes, we are winning the queen. So let's see how the game finished. After queen g2, this is a brilliant move, queen g2, to see it in a rapid game with few minutes on the clock, and to see all this. He wanted to end up in this position when he played knight e4. That's just brilliant. So after queen e2, rook takes, bishop takes, queen f3, and yes, white has a rook and a piece for the queen, but look at his king, it's in the middle of the board, so you don't want to really stroll around with the king in the middle of the board. That's why this position is lost, not only the material, but also that you will lose something. He's trying to defend his pieces, but black just captures even more pawns, gives a few more checks, and after d4, Vachier resigned because if he takes on d4, queen d5 wins a piece, and if he doesn't do it, well, there are not many squares for the rook. Let's just play something like rook e1. There will be even more checks, and eventually he will lose either the rook or the knight, depending on the position. In the other position, the knight. In this position, the rook. It's over. But it's all over because in this position, after knight f5, he saw that knight e4, it doesn't matter that he blunders bishop h6. It's a move that it looked like, oh my, Vishy has just missed bishop h6, he's losing. No, he saw all this. He wanted to play this position, he wanted to go for queen c7, and after knight g7, knight takes f2, queen h2, and queen g2, the key move of the combination. I am just impressed. I'm still impressed by this game. I saw it live. I was commentating on this game with Jan, and I can still not believe that it happened. It's just a tactical masterpiece. I know this is a middle game show and I'm strategy, but I love this game, so I had to show it as the last game of today's lesson. So I hope that you like these games. The main game of today's show was about Magnus Carlsen's victory, that you remember it was this very slow maneuvering position where he basically squeezed water out of stone. He had this position where it looked just like equal, no danger for black or whatsoever, and he ended up having this beautiful position on the board. So just remain with the picture of this position where black's pieces are completely paralyzed. And the next time you have an equal position, try to find a way to somehow create a tiny little difference between your position and the opponent's position. Try to improve your position little by little. Try to restrict the opponent's possibilities. Try to play like Magnus Carlsen and Anatoly Karpov. Try to think prophylactic. That was our previous topic, and I believe that this game was also very much in connection with the topic of prophylaxis. This was about the Grand Chess Tour in Leuven, Belgium. The 3 games that I like the most. There are so many good games from there, so if you haven't seen them, watch our broadcast on Chess24 on the Grand Chess Tour in Leuven. You can replay all the videos from those 4 days of action, rapid and blitz. You can also find the games in our database, so make sure that you check those games. There have been many nice games, many instructive games. And I will see you next Wednesday for the next strategy show. It's going to be a normal Middlegame show. This was a special edition on the Leuven Grand Chess Tour. I hope that you liked it. I hope that you enjoyed watching these games with me, learning from the best players in the world. I will see you next week and have a nice time in the meantime. Bye bye.